Welcome, and take a slow breath before we begin. Today's story is not one of sudden explosions or dramatic battles, but of something far quieter, far more ordinary, and ultimately far more devastating. It is a story that unfolds not on a battlefield, but in narrow streets, river docks, tea houses, and private rooms filled with smoke. To understand how an empire was weakened and a society slowly reshaped, we must travel back to southern China, to the year 1839, and to a city that stood at the crossroads of global trade, Canton, known today as Guangzhou. At first glance, Canton in the early 19th century looked like a city at the height of its confidence. Located along the Pearl River, it was China's primary window to the outside world, the only port where Western merchants were officially allowed to trade. Tall warehouses lined the riverbanks. Sailboats, cargo ships, and foreign vessels crowded the water. Tea chests, silk bundles, porcelain crates, and spices moved steadily through docks and customs houses. The rhythms of commerce shaped daily life, from sunrise to sunset. This was a city deeply connected to the global economy, even if most of its residents never left its walls. Yet beneath this appearance of prosperity, something was beginning to change. The air carried a tension that had little to do with weather or trade disputes. It was quieter than that, more personal. In back rooms, alleyway shops, and private homes, a substance had begun to alter routines, habits, and expectations. Opium, once a limited medicinal ingredient, was becoming an everyday presence. It did not arrive with violence. It arrived gradually, wrapped in trade contracts, profit calculations, and imperial ambitions far beyond the city itself. To understand why Canton became the center of this crisis, we must first understand Britain's growing hunger for Chinese goods. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, tea had become more than a beverage in Britain. It was a ritual, a social marker, and an economic obsession. Tea consumption soared across all classes, from aristocrats to factory workers. Alongside tea came silk, porcelain, and other luxury items that British consumers eagerly demanded. China, meanwhile, wanted very little from Britain in return. Chinese officials viewed European manufactured goods as inferior or unnecessary, and trade was strictly controlled. As a result, Britain paid for Chinese goods almost entirely in silver. Ship after ship left British ports loaded with silver bullion, only to return with tea. Over time, this created a serious economic problem. Britain's silver reserves steadily drained away, alarming merchants, bankers, and government officials alike. From London's perspective, the trade relationship was unsustainable. Something had to change. The solution, however, did not come from innovation or mutual exchange. It came from exploitation. British officials and merchants turned their attention to India, a colony already under strong British control. In India, opium poppies could be grown cheaply and in massive quantities. Opium had a market in China, despite being officially restricted. If Britain could sell opium to Chinese buyers, silver would flow back into British hands. Tea would no longer cost Britain its wealth. The imbalance would be reversed. On paper, this was framed as commerce. In reality, it was a calculated gamble with another society's stability. By the early 1800s, opium shipments began moving steadily toward China's southern coast. Officially, opium was banned, but enforcement was uneven and often undermined by corruption. Foreign traders anchored their ships offshore, transferring opium to Chinese smugglers who distributed it inland. Canton, already the center of foreign trade, naturally became the hub of this growing underground economy. At first, opium use remained limited. It was consumed mostly by the wealthy, the curious, or those seeking relief from physical pain. But availability changed everything. As supply increased, prices fell. Opium became easier to access, and its presence expanded into ordinary neighborhoods. What had once been rare became routine. What had once been hidden became normalized. Daily life in Canton began to subtly shift. Dock workers smoked opium to ease exhaustion. Merchants used it to escape stress. Scholars and officials, pressured by exams and bureaucracy, found temporary calm in its effects. Over time, the habit crept into every layer of society. It crossed class boundaries with ease, dissolving distinctions that had once been rigid. Opium dens became places where people gathered, talked, and withdrew from the pressures of reality, if only for a short while. This is what made the crisis so dangerous. It did not announce itself loudly. There were no immediate riots, no instant collapse. Instead, productivity declined quietly. Money disappeared slowly. Families noticed that income no longer stretched as far as it once had. Silver, the backbone of China's monetary system, began flowing out of local economies and into the hands of foreign traders. The effects were gradual, but relentless. Meanwhile, British merchants in Canton lived in a different reality. They operated within a tightly controlled foreign enclave, largely insulated from the consequences of the trade they fueled. For them, opium was a ledger entry, a shipment, a profit margin. Moral questions were brushed aside with arguments about supply and demand. If China wanted opium, they reasoned, Britain was simply providing it. Responsibility, in their view, rested elsewhere. This distance, geographical, cultural, and moral, allowed the trade to expand without restraint. Each year, more opium arrived. Each year, more silver left China. Each year, dependency deepened. Chinese authorities were not blind to what was happening. Reports reached Beijing describing declining productivity, rising addiction, and worsening corruption among local officials. Laws against opium already existed, but enforcement was weak. Some officials accepted bribes. Others feared provoking unrest. Many simply felt overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. The system that had governed China's trade for centuries was no longer sufficient to manage the pressures of a globalizing world. By 1839, Canton stood at a breaking point. The city was still bustling. Tea still moved through warehouses. Ships still crowded the river. But the foundation beneath that activity was cracking. Opium had woven itself into daily life so thoroughly that removing it would cause shock. Allowing it to continue, however, threatened long-term collapse. This tension between short-term comfort and long-term survival defined the moment. Ordinary people felt it in their homes and workplaces. Officials felt it in impossible decisions. Foreign merchants, largely shielded from consequences, continued to profit. The stage was set for confrontation, though few yet understood how dramatic it would become. The crisis in Canton was no longer just a local problem. It was a collision between two worldviews, one that prioritized controlled order and moral governance, and another that prioritized free trade and imperial advantage. Both sides believed they were acting rationally. Both sides believed the other was unreasonable. And so, in the quiet streets of Canton in 1839, amid tea crates and drifting smoke, the seeds of a much larger conflict were already planted. Not through open aggression, but through routine, habit, and economic calculation. What followed would reshape China's relationship with the world and leave a legacy that still echoes today. Britain's deepening involvement in China did not begin with conflict or confrontation, but with a habit so ordinary that it barely seemed political at all: drinking tea. By the late 18th century, tea had become woven into the fabric of British daily life. It was no longer a luxury reserved for the elite. It was a national ritual. Families gathered around teapots in the morning and evening, workers paused for tea breaks, and social gatherings revolved around carefully brewed cups. Tea symbolized comfort, respectability, and stability in a rapidly industrializing society. As demand exploded, so did Britain's dependence on China, the primary source of high-quality tea. This dependence created a quiet but serious problem. China did not share Britain's enthusiasm for foreign goods. Chinese officials viewed their civilization as largely self-sufficient, rich in resources, culture, and craftsmanship. European manufactured items were often dismissed as inferior or unnecessary. As a result, trade between the two empires flowed in only one direction. British ships arrived in Chinese ports loaded with silver, not products. They left heavy with tea, silk, porcelain, and luxury goods that would be sold at enormous profit back home. For decades, this arrangement seemed acceptable to China. Silver strengthened the imperial treasury, supported the monetary system, and reinforced China's sense of economic superiority. But for Britain, the situation was becoming increasingly alarming. Silver was the backbone of international trade and domestic finance. Watching it steadily leave the country year after year unsettled merchants, bankers, and government officials. The trade imbalance was not just inconvenient. It was perceived as a threat to national strength. This anxiety grew sharper as Britain's population expanded and industrial output surged. Factories produced textiles, tools, and metal goods at unprecedented speed, yet China remained uninterested in buying them. Britain, an empire built on commerce, found itself locked into a relationship where it paid endlessly but sold almost nothing. From London's perspective, this was not a partnership, it was a drain. Attempts were made to change China's mind through diplomacy and negotiation. British envoys argued for broader trade access, more open ports, and greater acceptance of British goods. These efforts were met with polite resistance. Chinese authorities operated under a worldview shaped by centuries of imperial tradition, where foreign traders were seen not as equals but as regulated outsiders. Trade was permitted, but strictly on Chinese terms. As frustration grew, British thinking shifted. If China would not buy British goods willingly, then Britain needed to offer something China already wanted. The solution emerged not from factories or innovation, but from empire. In India, under British control, vast fields of poppies were already being cultivated. Opium had long been used in limited medical contexts across Asia. Its effects were known. Its market potential, however, was only just being fully realized. British merchants and officials recognized an opportunity. Opium could be grown cheaply in India, processed efficiently, and sold at high profit. More importantly, Chinese buyers were willing to pay for it in silver. This single fact transformed opium from a regional crop into a strategic commodity. It offered Britain a way to reverse the flow of silver and regain control over its trade balance. The moral implications of this choice were rarely discussed in official terms. The language used was economic, technical, and detached. Trade deficits, balance sheets, shipping volumes, these were the concerns debated in offices and boardrooms. The effects on Chinese society were distant and abstract, occurring thousands of miles away. For many decision-makers, responsibility ended at the dock. Once opium entered the equation, the nature of Britain's relationship with China changed fundamentally. Tea was no longer just a desirable product. It became the prize at the end of a calculated exchange. Britain would no longer pay endlessly for Chinese goods. Instead, it would dictate the terms through supply, demand, and imperial reach. Canton, as the primary legal port for foreign trade, became the focal point of this new system. British ships arrived carrying opium grown in Indian soil, processed under British supervision, and sold through networks designed to bypass Chinese law. The trade was technically illegal within China, but it was tolerated, ignored, or quietly facilitated by officials who lacked the resources or will to stop it. As silver began flowing back into British hands, the trade imbalance slowly reversed. From Britain's perspective, the problem had been solved. Tea continued to arrive in vast quantities. Silver reserves stabilized. Profits soared. The system worked at least for one side. Inside China, however, the consequences were unfolding differently. Silver, once abundant, began disappearing from local markets. Taxes became harder to collect. Prices fluctuated. Economic stability weakened. These changes did not happen overnight. They crept forward gradually, often unnoticed until the effects became impossible to ignore. The obsession with tea, which had begun as a cultural preference, had evolved into a driving force of imperial policy. Britain's need to secure its supply at any cost reshaped global trade routes and local realities. What appeared in London as a financial correction appeared in Canton as a growing social strain. For Chinese merchants and citizens, the presence of foreign traders became increasingly tied to economic hardship rather than prosperity. Tea exports enriched some, but opium imports drained communities. The same ships that carried wealth outward brought dependency inward. The balance Britain had sought was achieved not through mutual exchange, but through asymmetry and leverage. This imbalance of power was reinforced by distance. British consumers sipping tea in quiet homes were far removed from the conditions that made their comfort possible. The human cost was invisible, separated by oceans and filtered through trade statistics. Tea arrived cleanly packaged, stripped of its broader context. By the late 1830s, the connection between tea and opium was firmly established. One could not exist at its current scale without the other. Britain's national habit was sustained by a system that increasingly destabilized another society. What began as a commercial challenge had become a moral and political fault line. Chinese officials faced a dilemma with no easy answer. Restricting opium threatened unrest among those already dependent on it and risked confrontation with powerful foreign interests. Allowing it to continue meant watching the country's economic foundation weaken further. The trade imbalance Britain once feared had now shifted entirely onto China. This was the deeper irony of the moment. Britain's solution to its own problem had created an even larger one elsewhere. Tea still flowed freely, enjoyed daily by millions who never questioned its origins. Meanwhile, in Canton and beyond, the cost of maintaining that flow accumulated quietly, shaping decisions that would soon lead to open conflict. What had started as a simple desire for comfort had evolved into a system of pressure, dependency, and imbalance. And as the gap between British benefit and Chinese loss widened, it became clear that such a system could not remain stable forever. The obsession with tea had set forces in motion that neither empire could fully control, drawing them steadily toward a confrontation that would change history. The transformation of opium from a regional crop into a central pillar of global trade did not happen by accident. It was the result of careful planning, imperial control, and a system designed to maximize profit while minimizing accountability. At the heart of this system was India, a vast colony under British dominance, whose land and labor were reshaped to serve distant economic goals. In India, the cultivation of opium was not simply encouraged, it was organized. British authorities oversaw the growing of poppies in specific regions, particularly in Bengal and surrounding areas. Farmers were contracted, often pressured, to dedicate their land to poppy cultivation instead of food crops. The process was tightly regulated, seeds distributed, harvests monitored, production standardized. What emerged was not a loose agricultural practice, but an industrial operation rooted in imperial administration. For many Indian farmers, opium cultivation was not a choice made freely. Contracts were binding, debts accumulated quickly, and failure to meet quotas carried severe consequences. Fields that once produced food for local consumption were converted into poppy farms serving foreign markets. The risks: crop failure, soil depletion, financial ruin were carried by the farmers. The profits flowed upward. Once harvested, raw opium was processed in British-controlled factories, packaged, and prepared for export. From there, it traveled by ship across the Indian Ocean, through Southeast Asian waters, and toward the southern coast of China. This long journey connected distant villages in India to backrooms in Canton, linking lives that would never meet but were bound by the same trade. The structure of the opium system allowed Britain to maintain a careful distance. Officially, the British government did not sell opium directly in China. Instead, it auctioned opium in India to private merchants, who then transported it to Chinese waters. This separation provided plausible deniability. When criticized, British officials could claim they were not responsible for how the product was used once sold. In reality, the system functioned with full awareness of its consequences. British merchants understood the demand in China. They understood the profits to be made. And they understood that enforcement of Chinese laws was weak enough to allow the trade to continue. The separation between state and merchant was administrative, not moral. As opium shipments increased, so did the sophistication of smuggling networks. Foreign ships anchored offshore, beyond the reach of Chinese law. From there, smaller boats ferried the product inland, navigating rivers and channels that had served trade for centuries. Payments were made in silver. Records were kept discreetly. The system operated smoothly, quietly, and efficiently. For Britain, the results were immediate and measurable. Silver flowed back into British hands. Tea imports continued without interruption. The trade imbalance that had once caused panic now appeared resolved. Reports praised the effectiveness of the new system. Profits strengthened companies, shareholders, and imperial confidence. In China, the picture looked very different. Opium, once limited in scope, became increasingly visible. Its presence expanded from ports into inland cities, towns, and villages. Dependency grew not because of sudden coercion, but because availability reshaped habits. The more opium circulated, the more normalized its use became. What had once been a private indulgence evolved into a widespread social pattern. This normalization carried consequences beyond individual behavior. Time was lost. Productivity declined. Money that once supported families and communities was redirected toward sustaining habits. Silver, essential to China's economy, drained outward. These effects accumulated slowly, often unnoticed until they reached a critical mass. Chinese officials struggled to respond. The scale of the trade exceeded traditional enforcement methods. Coastal patrols were undermined by geography and corruption. Local authorities, often underpaid, faced impossible choices. Enforcing bans risked unrest and personal danger. Ignoring the trade meant contributing to long-term harm. Many chose inaction. Meanwhile, British narratives framed the situation differently. Opium was described as a commodity responding to demand. Responsibility was shifted onto Chinese consumers and officials. The role of British-controlled production and distribution was downplayed. The language of free trade masked the reality of unequal power. This imbalance extended beyond economics into perception. In Britain, the opium trade was distant and abstract. Few citizens connected their daily comforts to the systems sustaining them. Tea arrived cleanly packaged, detached from its broader context. India and China existed as names on maps, not lived realities. In China, however, the connection was impossible to ignore. Opium reshaped daily life in visible ways. Families felt its effects directly. Communities watched resources disappear. The sense of control over internal affairs weakened as foreign influence expanded without formal invasion. The opium system also exposed a deeper vulnerability. China's traditional trade framework had been designed for a world where foreign interactions were limited and regulated. It was not built to withstand an industrial empire capable of producing and distributing goods on a massive scale. The imbalance was structural, not temporary. By the late 1830s, the opium trade was no longer just a problem of legality or morality. It had become a test of sovereignty. Could China enforce its own laws within its borders? Could it protect its economy and social order from external pressure? Or would imperial trade override domestic authority? These questions loomed over Canton and beyond. The system Britain had built was profitable, efficient, and deeply entrenched. Dismantling it would require confrontation not just with merchants, but with an empire that had tied its economic stability to the continuation of the trade. What made the moment especially volatile was that both sides believed they were acting rationally. Britain saw opium as a solution to a financial problem. China saw it as a threat to societal stability. Neither was willing to step back easily. And so, as opium continued to flow from Indian fields to Chinese shores, the distance between cause and consequence narrowed. The system that had once seemed like a clever economic correction was revealing its true cost. The question was no longer whether change would come, but how and at what price. As opium became more embedded in everyday life, its presence began to quietly reshape the social fabric of Canton. What had once been a controlled port city governed by predictable routines started to feel different. Time moved more slowly in certain neighborhoods. Productivity dipped in ways that were hard to measure but impossible to ignore. Shops opened later. Work paused more often. Conversations lingered in spaces where smoke hung thick in the air, blurring hours together. Opium was no longer an exception. It was becoming a rhythm. Opium dens, in particular, emerged as a defining feature of this transformation. They were not always dark or hidden places. Some were clean, orderly rooms designed to feel welcoming. Cushions lined the floors. Lamps cast a warm glow. For many visitors, these spaces offered something rare in a demanding world: quiet, stillness, and temporary relief. People from different walks of life found themselves side by side: laborers, clerks, merchants, scholars sharing an experience that ignored social hierarchy. This collapse of boundaries was subtle but significant. Traditional Confucian order emphasized discipline, hierarchy, and self-control. Opium undermined those values not through rebellion, but through comfort. It offered escape without protest, withdrawal instead of resistance. Over time, this had a numbing effect on society's ability to respond to pressure. Problems that once provoked action now met resignation. Families felt the consequences first. Money that had once gone toward food, education, or savings was redirected. Small amounts at first, then more. Trust eroded quietly. Promises were postponed. Shame settled into households that struggled to explain where their resources had gone. The effects rippled outward, touching relatives, neighbors, and entire communities. Local officials were caught in the middle of this slow unraveling. Their responsibilities were clear on paper but impossible in practice. Enforcing bans required manpower they did not have. Challenging powerful smuggling networks risked retaliation. Salaries were often insufficient, making bribes tempting and, for some, necessary to survive. Corruption was not always driven by greed. Often it was driven by exhaustion and fear. This environment allowed the trade to persist even as awareness of its damage spread. Everyone could see the problem. Few could stop it. The system seemed too large, too entrenched, too profitable to confront directly. Foreign traders remained protected by distance and naval power. Local enforcers remained constrained by limited authority. Ordinary people bore the weight. Meanwhile, the economic impact deepened. Silver shortages became more pronounced. Taxes grew harder to collect. Government revenues shrank. As financial pressure increased, so did resentment. The opium trade was no longer just a social concern. It had become an economic threat to the stability of the state. Within the Qing court, debates intensified. Some officials argued for gradual reform and tolerance, believing sudden enforcement would cause unrest. Others warned that inaction would invite long-term collapse. Reports from the South painted an increasingly grim picture. The issue could no longer be dismissed as a regional problem. Amid this growing urgency, one figure stood out for his clarity and resolve. Lin Zexu, a scholar official known for his discipline and integrity, was appointed to address the crisis. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Lin viewed the situation not as an administrative inconvenience but as a moral emergency. To him, the damage caused by opium was incompatible with good governance. Lin arrived in Canton with a sense of purpose that immediately disrupted the status quo. He demanded accountability from officials, cracked down on corruption, and made it clear that tolerance would no longer be accepted. His approach was firm but methodical. He sought not chaos, but restoration of order. One of Lin's most decisive actions was the seizure of opium stocks held by foreign traders. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a direct challenge to the system that had allowed the trade to flourish. Tens of thousands of chests were confiscated. The scale of the operation sent a clear message: the era of quiet acceptance was ending. The destruction of the seized opium was carried out publicly, deliberately, and without compromise. It was dissolved and discarded in a controlled but unmistakable display of authority. For the Chinese population, the act was a rare assertion of control. For foreign merchants, it was a shock. Profits vanished overnight. Confidence in immunity was shaken. From the British perspective, this was unacceptable. What China viewed as law enforcement, Britain interpreted as an attack on commerce and property. The language of morality clashed with the language of trade. British merchants demanded compensation. Officials argued that free trade principles had been violated. This disagreement exposed the fundamental divide between the two empires. China believed it had the sovereign right to regulate harmful substances within its borders. Britain believed that trade, once established, should not be interrupted by local law. Neither side was willing to concede. As tensions escalated, communication broke down. Letters were exchanged, demands issued, deadlines set. Each side believed the other would eventually back down. Instead, positions hardened. Naval power loomed in the background, unspoken but understood. What had begun as an effort to correct a trade imbalance had evolved into a confrontation over authority, values, and control. The opium trade was no longer just about profit or habit. It had become a symbol of whose rules would prevail. For the people of Canton, the stakes were immediate and personal. They stood at the intersection of global forces far beyond their influence. Their city, once a gateway for goods, had become a fault line between empires. The quiet routines of daily life, tea drinking, river trade, market chatter continued, but beneath them ran a current of uncertainty. Something irreversible was approaching. The question was no longer whether change would come, but how much damage would be done before it arrived. And as ships gathered offshore and decisions were made in distant capitals, the smoke that once drifted lazily through Canton streets began to feel heavier, carrying with it the weight of a world on the edge of transformation. As the trade expanded, it relied less on secrecy and more on systems that quietly sustained it. Smuggling was no longer a side activity carried out by a few daring individuals. It had become an organized network that stretched from the open sea to the heart of the city. Along the Pearl River, small boats moved with practiced ease, transferring cargo at night or in plain sight, depending on the circumstances. Everyone involved knew their role. Everyone knew when to look away. Corruption was the oil that kept this machinery running. Local officials, customs inspectors, and patrol officers were placed in impossible positions. Their official duty was to enforce bans and protect public order. Their reality was far more complicated. Many were poorly paid and responsible for large districts with limited manpower. Confronting smugglers backed by foreign interests carried real risk, not only to careers but to personal safety. Bribes offered a way out, an unofficial solution to an unsolvable problem. At first, these payments were small. A favor here, a delayed inspection there. Over time, they became routine. What began as individual compromise hardened into institutional habit. Enforcement weakened not because the law was unclear, but because the cost of enforcing it grew too high. The system rewarded silence and punished resistance. Foreign traders understood this dynamic well. They learned which officials were flexible, which routes were safest, and which times were best for transport. The trade adapted constantly, responding to pressure with innovation. If one channel closed, another opened. The scale of the operation ensured that even determined crackdowns struggled to make lasting impact. For ordinary citizens, this erosion of authority was deeply unsettling. Laws existed, but their enforcement felt arbitrary. Justice appeared negotiable. Trust in institutions weakened as people saw rules applied selectively. This loss of confidence mattered as much as the economic damage. A society's stability depends not only on resources, but on belief in fairness and order. Smuggling also blurred moral boundaries. Participation was not limited to criminals or outsiders. Fishermen transported packages. Shopkeepers provided storage. Middlemen facilitated transactions. Each individual role seemed small, even harmless, but together they sustained a system that harmed the wider community. Responsibility became diluted, spread thin across countless hands. The silver that flowed into these networks did not circulate evenly. Some accumulated wealth quickly. Others saw little benefit beyond temporary relief. Inequality sharpened. Resentment grew. The visible success of those tied to the trade contrasted sharply with the struggles of families drained by dependency and rising costs. Within the Qing administration, awareness of the problem deepened. Reports detailed not only the spread of opium, but the collapse of discipline among officials tasked with stopping it. The issue was no longer just foreign pressure. It was internal decay. Reforming the system required confronting corruption, restoring authority, and challenging foreign traders simultaneously, a task of enormous complexity. This was the environment into which decisive action would soon be taken. Years of tolerance had failed. Gradual measures had been absorbed and neutralized by the trade's adaptability. The realization settled in that half measures were no longer enough. To change the situation, the entire structure supporting it would have to be confronted. For those benefiting from the trade, this prospect was alarming. Corruption had provided predictability. Smuggling routes were stable. Profits were reliable. Any serious attempt to restore enforcement threatened not just income, but the fragile balance that allowed the system to function. Tension built quietly but steadily. Officials watched one another, uncertain who could be trusted. Merchants moved goods faster, anticipating disruption. Ordinary people sensed unease without fully understanding its source. The city felt alert, as if holding its breath. What made this moment especially dangerous was that corruption had removed the usual safety valves. When laws lose credibility, negotiation becomes harder. Compromise feels like weakness. Each side assumes the other will exploit restraint. In such an environment, decisive action once taken tends to escalate rather than resolve. The smuggling networks and the corruption that sustained them had done more than enable trade. They had hollowed out the middle ground where solutions might have existed. By the time enforcement truly arrived, patience had already been exhausted. And so, as the web of bribery and illegal transport tightened its grip on Canton, it also narrowed the path forward. The city had lived too long in quiet accommodation. The reckoning, when it came, would not be subtle. By the time decisive authority arrived, the situation in Canton had reached a critical threshold. The trade was no longer hidden, corruption was no longer isolated, and the damage was no longer theoretical. It was visible in shrinking revenues, weakened discipline, and a growing sense that control was slipping away. This was the moment when the Qing court turned to Lin Zexu, a man whose reputation for integrity set him apart in an era of compromise. Lin Zexu was not a radical by nature. He was a scholar, steeped in Confucian ideals of moral governance, responsibility, and restraint. To him, the purpose of authority was not profit or convenience, but the well-being of society as a whole. When he studied the reports from Canton, he did not see a mere trade dispute. He saw a moral failure unfolding at a national scale. Upon his appointment, Lin moved quickly and deliberately. He arrived in Canton with clear intent and broad authority, bypassing many of the local power structures that had become compromised. His first actions targeted internal decay. Officials were investigated, warnings issued, and expectations made unmistakably clear. Compliance was no longer optional. What distinguished Lin's approach was his refusal to negotiate away principle. Previous efforts had tried to balance enforcement with tolerance, hoping the problem would diminish on its own. Lin rejected this logic. He believed that allowing harm to continue for the sake of stability was itself destabilizing. Order, in his view, could only be restored through firm action. One of Lin's earliest moves was to demand that foreign merchants surrender their opium stocks voluntarily. This was not a request made quietly or informally. It was issued as a clear directive, grounded in Chinese law. Merchants were given a choice: comply or face consequences. For many, this was unprecedented. The assumption that foreign traders operated beyond meaningful reach was suddenly challenged. Resistance followed. Merchants delayed, negotiated, and appealed to foreign representatives. Lin remained unmoved. He sealed off foreign trading quarters, restricted movement, and applied pressure without resorting to violence. His strategy was to isolate the trade, cut off its protections, and force compliance through legal authority rather than force. Eventually, the standoff broke. Vast quantities of opium were surrendered, more than anyone had publicly acknowledged existed. The sheer volume revealed the scale of the trade in a way statistics never could. What had been debated abstractly now stood piled in physical form, undeniable and overwhelming. Lin then made a decision that would echo far beyond Canton. Rather than store or resell the confiscated opium, he ordered its destruction. The process was careful and public, designed to eliminate any possibility of reuse. This was not only a practical measure. It was a statement. The trade would not be tolerated, and its profits would not be preserved. For many in China, this act restored a sense of dignity. It signaled that the state was willing to defend its laws and its people, even in the face of foreign pressure. Lin became a symbol of moral resolve, a reminder that authority could still serve principle. Abroad, however, the reaction was sharply different. British merchants saw the destruction as an assault on property and commerce. Losses were counted immediately. Demands for compensation followed. What China framed as law enforcement, Britain framed as injustice. This clash of interpretations revealed how far apart the two sides had grown. Lin's actions were rooted in a belief that sovereignty included the right to regulate harmful trade. British objections were rooted in a belief that trade rights, once established, should override local restrictions. Neither perspective was flexible enough to accommodate the other. Lin attempted to communicate directly, even writing to British authorities to explain his reasoning. His appeals emphasized responsibility, fairness, and mutual respect. He argued that what harmed China would ultimately harm trade itself. These arguments found little traction. Economic interests had hardened positions. Within Canton, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The long period of quiet accommodation ended. Uncertainty replaced routine. Merchants reassessed risks. Officials watched events unfold with both relief and fear. Ordinary citizens sensed that something irreversible had occurred. Lin Zexu's crackdown did more than disrupt the opium trade. It forced a reckoning. It exposed the incompatibility of the existing system with China's laws and values. It drew a line that could not be easily erased. From this point forward, compromise became increasingly difficult. The destruction of opium had transformed a long-running problem into an open confrontation. What followed would no longer be decided quietly in backrooms or along riverbanks. The dispute had moved into the realm of power, pride, and national will. The calm surface of Canton's river still reflected the sky, but beneath it, currents were shifting fast. The actions taken in the name of restoration had set forces in motion that would soon extend far beyond the city itself. The consequences of the opium trade were not limited to personal habits or moral debates. They reached deep into the foundations of China's economy. Long before open conflict began, the financial damage was already unfolding in slow, persistent ways. What made this damage especially dangerous was its invisibility. There was no single moment of collapse, no dramatic signal that something had gone wrong. Instead, the system weakened quietly, year by year. Silver lay at the heart of this problem. In Qing China, silver was not just a store of wealth. It was the backbone of taxation, trade, and everyday transactions. Farmers paid taxes in silver. Merchants measured success in silver. Local governments relied on silver flows to function. When silver began leaving the country in large quantities, the effects rippled outward in every direction. As opium imports increased, silver flowed steadily into the hands of foreign traders and smugglers. At first, this outflow was masked by the ongoing profits of tea exports. But over time, the imbalance became harder to ignore. Silver grew scarcer in local markets. Prices fluctuated unpredictably. Ordinary people felt the strain long before officials could fully quantify it. For farmers, the impact was immediate and harsh. Taxes remained fixed, but the value of silver rose as it became harder to obtain. What had once been a manageable obligation became a burden. To meet tax demands, families sold possessions, borrowed money, or fell into debt. Crop failures or bad seasons became catastrophic rather than survivable. The margin for error vanished. Merchants faced a different but equally damaging reality. Trade depended on stable currency and predictable exchange. As silver supplies tightened, transactions slowed. Credit became riskier. Prices of everyday goods rose, while wages failed to keep pace. Markets that had once been lively and reliable grew volatile. Confidence, essential to commerce, eroded. Local governments struggled to function under these conditions. Tax collection became increasingly difficult, not because people refused to pay, but because they simply could not. Shortfalls appeared in government accounts. Public works suffered. Relief efforts during floods or famines became harder to fund. Each weakness reinforced the next, creating a cycle of decline. What made the situation particularly frustrating for Chinese officials was the sense of imbalance. The silver leaving the country was not being exchanged for productive investment or mutual development. It was being traded for a substance that weakened labor, drained resources, and offered no long-term benefit. From their perspective, this was not trade. It was extraction. The economic strain also deepened social divides. Those connected to the opium trade, smugglers, intermediaries, and certain merchants sometimes accumulated wealth quickly. Meanwhile, those dependent on stable wages or agriculture fell behind. Inequality sharpened tensions within communities, feeding resentment and mistrust. These pressures altered how people viewed authority. When economic systems fail, blame spreads easily. Local officials were accused of corruption or incompetence, sometimes fairly, sometimes not. The central government appeared distant and ineffective. Faith in institutions weakened as everyday hardships grew more visible. The link between opium and economic decline became increasingly clear to those in power. Reports to the Qing court emphasized not only moral harm, but fiscal danger. The empire's ability to govern depended on its financial stability. Without silver, the machinery of state could not function. This realization raised the stakes of enforcement dramatically. Addressing opium was no longer a matter of public health or social order. It was a matter of survival. Allowing the trade to continue unchecked risked long-term collapse. Acting against it risked confrontation with powerful foreign interests. The choice was stark and unavoidable. Within this context, Lin Zexu's crackdown took on greater significance. His actions were not simply about law enforcement. They were an attempt to halt economic hemorrhage, to stabilize the foundation beneath society. The destruction of opium symbolized a refusal to sacrifice long-term stability for short-term comfort. For Britain, however, these economic consequences remained largely invisible. The silver flowing out of China flowed into British hands, easing pressures at home. Tea remained affordable. Profits remained strong. The costs were externalized, borne by communities far away. This asymmetry deepened misunderstanding. Britain saw resistance as obstruction. China saw trade as exploitation. Each side measured success by different standards. Without a shared framework, dialogue faltered. By the late 1830s, the economic damage within China had reached a point where retreat seemed impossible. The trade had reshaped financial realities so deeply that reversing it would require decisive, disruptive action. The cost of inaction had become too high. The quiet crisis of silver outflow set the stage for everything that followed. It transformed opium from a social issue into a national emergency. It ensured that when conflict finally came, it would not be over abstract principles, but over the very foundations of economic life. The system that had once seemed profitable and manageable now revealed its true nature. It had hollowed out stability from within. And once that truth was understood, the path toward confrontation became almost inevitable. As economic pressure tightened and authority weakened, opium dens took on a role far more complex than outsiders often imagined. They were not merely places of consumption. They became social environments shaped by the stresses of the time. In a world that felt increasingly uncertain, these spaces offered something many people struggled to find elsewhere: predictability, quiet, and temporary relief from constant pressure. For those who entered them, opium dens were often carefully arranged to feel calm and orderly. Soft lighting, cushions, and slow routines created an atmosphere sharply different from the noise of markets and docks. Conversation was unhurried. Time felt less demanding. For individuals carrying the weight of financial strain, family expectations, or bureaucratic pressure, this pause felt meaningful. It was not rebellion against society, but withdrawal from it. What made these spaces particularly significant was how they blurred social boundaries. In traditional Chinese society, hierarchy shaped nearly every interaction. Status, education, age, and occupation determined where one belonged. Inside opium dens, those distinctions softened. A merchant might lie beside a laborer. A scholar might share space with a boatman. The usual markers of rank mattered less than the shared desire for escape. This leveling effect carried quiet consequences. Confucian ideals emphasized discipline, duty, and participation in family and state. Opium offered an alternative value system, one built around personal comfort and detachment. It did not challenge authority directly, but it weakened the habits that sustained it. Responsibility felt heavier. Engagement felt optional. Over time, this shift altered how people responded to hardship. Where previous generations might have organized, petitioned, or resisted, many now turned inward. Problems that demanded collective solutions were met with individual retreat. This did not mean people stopped caring. It meant they felt less capable of acting. Families felt the strain deeply. When individuals withdrew, relationships frayed. Trust eroded slowly, often without confrontation. Loved ones noticed changes in behavior, in priorities, in presence. Conversations shortened. Commitments slipped. The damage was emotional as much as economic, and far harder to repair. Communities, too, felt the impact. Neighborhoods that once relied on cooperation and mutual support became quieter, more fragmented. Public spaces lost some of their energy. Shared responsibility weakened as individuals focused on managing their own burdens. This fragmentation made it harder to respond collectively when crises emerged. From the perspective of officials, this social withdrawal was alarming. A population that disengages becomes difficult to govern not because it resists, but because it no longer responds. Orders lose urgency. Appeals lose resonance. Authority depends not only on force, but on participation. Yet it would be a mistake to view those who entered opium dens simply as victims or failures. Many were responding rationally to circumstances they did not create. Economic pressure, instability, and uncertainty pushed people toward whatever offered relief. In this sense, opium dens were symptoms as much as causes, reflecting deeper fractures within society. Foreign observers often misunderstood this dynamic. They saw consumption and assumed weakness, without recognizing the conditions that made withdrawal appealing. The human context, the exhaustion, the lack of alternatives, the slow erosion of trust was invisible from the outside. As opium dens multiplied, they became quiet indicators of systemic strain. Their growth signaled not indulgence, but imbalance. A society that needs widespread escape is a society under pressure. This reality added urgency to the efforts of reformers. The problem was no longer confined to trade or economics. It had reshaped social behavior itself. Restoring stability would require more than laws and enforcement. It would require rebuilding confidence, purpose, and engagement, tasks far more difficult than confiscating goods. The existence of opium dens thus represented a crossroads. They showed how deeply the trade had embedded itself into daily life, and how challenging removal would be. Eliminating opium meant not only stopping supply, but confronting the reasons people sought it in the first place. As tensions escalated between China and Britain, this social dimension was often overlooked. Diplomatic arguments focused on rights and trade. Military plans focused on strength and strategy. Meanwhile, within Canton and beyond, ordinary people navigated lives quietly altered by years of gradual retreat. The dens remained, not as centers of defiance, but as reminders of how far the situation had drifted from balance. They illustrated a truth that statistics could not capture. The cost of the opium trade was measured not only in silver lost or laws broken, but in attention withdrawn from life itself. By the time confrontation loomed openly on the horizon, the social fabric had already been stretched thin. The question facing China was no longer whether opium was harmful. It was whether a society shaped by years of quiet escape could recover its sense of direction in time to withstand what was coming next. As opium use spread deeper into society, its most painful consequences unfolded at the most personal level. Beyond economic strain and social withdrawal lay the slow unraveling of individual lives. What made this damage especially tragic was how quietly it occurred. There were no clear turning points, no dramatic moments when everything fell apart at once. Instead, loss accumulated gradually, often unnoticed until it had already taken root. For many individuals, opium began as relief rather than excess. It eased physical exhaustion after long hours of labor. It softened anxiety in a world that felt increasingly unstable. In the beginning, the cost seemed manageable. Time slowed, worries faded, and discomfort receded. But over time, the balance shifted. Relief gave way to reliance, and reliance to routine. Health was often the first casualty. Strength faded. Sleep patterns changed. Appetite diminished. What had once felt like rest became a cycle of recovery and return. People found themselves less capable of sustained work, less present in daily tasks. This decline was not sudden, but persistent, eroding confidence along with physical ability. Wealth followed a similar path. Small, regular expenses added up. Money set aside for emergencies or family needs was redirected. Borrowing filled the gap at first, but debts accumulated quickly. Promises to cut back were sincere, yet difficult to keep. Over time, financial insecurity became constant, feeding the very stress that had driven people toward opium in the first place. Family relationships suffered deeply. Trust weakened as priorities shifted. Loved ones struggled to understand changes in behavior and presence. Arguments flared, then faded into resignation. Children felt absence even when parents were physically present. Responsibilities were postponed, sometimes indefinitely. The emotional toll was heavy. Shame often accompanied dependence, making open discussion difficult. People withdrew not only from work and community, but from those closest to them. Isolation reinforced reliance, creating a cycle that was hard to break. Support networks frayed at the moment they were most needed. What made this situation especially painful was the contrast between individual suffering and external profit. While families struggled to hold together, merchants continued to earn. While health declined, trade volumes rose. The imbalance felt deeply unjust to those living its consequences. This disparity fueled quiet resentment. People understood, even if vaguely, that forces beyond their control had shaped their circumstances. The sense of being used, of bearing the cost of someone else's gain, cut deeply. Yet there were few channels through which this frustration could be expressed. Officials recognized this human cost, but often lacked the means to address it effectively. Relief measures were limited. Enforcement was inconsistent. Without addressing the broader system, individual interventions felt insufficient. The problem was not a collection of personal failures. It was a structural crisis manifesting in personal lives. The long-term impact of this damage extended beyond the individuals directly affected. When large portions of a population lose health, stability, and trust, society as a whole becomes more fragile. Labor shortages emerge. Skills decline. Innovation slows. The future feels narrower. This fragility heightened the stakes of every decision made by those in power. The opium trade was no longer just undermining the present. It was threatening the next generation. Children growing up in unstable households faced fewer opportunities and greater hardship. The cost would echo forward. For Britain, this dimension remained distant. Profits were counted. Shipments were logged. The human stories remained largely invisible. Trade discussions rarely accounted for lives altered or families strained. The system encouraged this blindness by design. In China, however, these stories accumulated into a shared awareness. They circulated through neighborhoods and families, shaping opinion and emotion. The issue was no longer abstract. It was personal, repeated, and unavoidable. This growing awareness contributed to the urgency behind decisive action. It strengthened resolve among those who believed tolerance had gone too far. The cost of allowing the trade to continue was no longer theoretical. It was visible in weakened bodies, strained households, and diminished futures. By the time confrontation with foreign powers became inevitable, the ground had already shifted. The opium trade had extracted more than silver. It had drained resilience, trust, and possibility from countless lives. This human cost would shape how China remembered the conflict that followed. It ensured that resistance was fueled not only by policy or pride, but by lived experience. And it guaranteed that the legacy of the trade would endure long after the last shipment arrived, embedded in memory as much as in history. As the damage spread through households and communities, corruption hardened into something deeper and more dangerous, a system that trapped everyone it touched. What had once been occasional compromise became a way of life, binding officials, traders, and intermediaries into a structure that was difficult to escape without consequence. This was no longer a matter of a few dishonest individuals. It was systemic erosion. For local officials, the dilemma was constant and exhausting. Their formal duty was to uphold the law, protect the population, and preserve order. Yet the tools to do so were inadequate. Resources were scarce, authority was undermined by foreign pressure, and enforcement invited retaliation. In this environment, corruption often appeared not as betrayal, but as survival. Accepting bribes initially felt like a temporary solution. A way to avoid confrontation. A way to maintain surface-level stability. But each compromise made the next easier. Once entangled, officials became vulnerable. Those who accepted payments could be threatened with exposure. Those who tried to reverse course faced isolation or worse. Integrity, once surrendered, was difficult to reclaim. This trap extended upward through the bureaucracy. Reports were softened. Numbers were adjusted. Problems were framed as manageable even when they were not. The system rewarded reassurance over honesty. Bad news stalled careers. Compliance ensured continuity. Over time, reality itself became negotiable. For ordinary people, this erosion of trust was devastating. Laws still existed, but they felt hollow. Enforcement seemed arbitrary. Justice appeared to favor those with connections or money. When institutions lose credibility, cynicism replaces respect. People stop expecting fairness and start expecting inconsistency. This shift mattered deeply. A society does not function on rules alone. It functions on belief in those rules. Once that belief weakens, cooperation declines. People protect themselves rather than contribute to the whole. Community bonds fray. Social responsibility gives way to private calculation. The opium trade thrived in this environment. Smugglers relied on predictability, and corruption provided it. Bribes became part of operating costs, factored into profit margins. The trade adapted not just to laws, but to their selective enforcement. Every compromised official made the system more resilient. Reform became increasingly difficult. Honest officials found themselves isolated, lacking support and resources. Whistleblowers risked retaliation. Efforts to clean house threatened to expose many, creating resistance even among those who privately acknowledged the problem. This internal decay compounded external pressure. While foreign traders challenged Chinese authority from the outside, corruption weakened it from within. The state appeared strong in tradition but fragile in practice. Its ability to act decisively depended on individuals who had been worn down by years of compromise. The psychological toll on officials should not be underestimated. Living in constant contradiction between duty and reality created fatigue and resignation. Many stopped believing meaningful change was possible. This quiet despair was as damaging as any external threat. For reformers, this environment made urgency unavoidable. The longer the system persisted, the more entrenched it became. Half measures only deepened entanglement. Restoring authority would require not only confronting foreign trade, but dismantling networks of corruption that had grown comfortable and powerful. This realization sharpened the stakes of Lin Zexu's actions. His crackdown was not just about opium. It was about reclaiming the credibility of governance itself. By enforcing the law visibly and decisively, he challenged the assumption that rules were negotiable. Yet such actions also carried risk. Exposing corruption threatened livelihoods and reputations. Resistance was inevitable, both open and subtle. The system did not collapse quietly. What made this moment so volatile was the convergence of pressures. Economic strain, social withdrawal, personal suffering, and institutional decay had all reached critical levels at the same time. The margin for error was gone. In this context, every decision carried amplified consequences. Leniency would signal weakness. Force would provoke backlash. Neutrality was no longer an option. The corruption that had once allowed the opium trade to flourish now ensured that any attempt to end it would be explosive. The system had hollowed out the middle ground where gradual reform might have worked. By the time events moved toward open conflict, trust within institutions and between nations had already been deeply damaged. What remained was a brittle structure under immense strain, waiting for a shock strong enough to break it. And when that shock arrived, it would not only shatter trade arrangements. It would expose how thoroughly compromise had reshaped power, responsibility, and belief itself. As tensions escalated, the social fabric began to fray in ways that were impossible to ignore. Communities once bound by shared customs and mutual reliance now found themselves divided, not only by the external pressures of trade and foreign influence but also by internal distrust. Families who had once relied on each other for support now debated over survival strategies, and neighbors became wary of one another, unsure who might be swayed or corrupted by outside interests. The personal became political, and everyday life was suffused with uncertainty. This breakdown in trust affected every layer of society. Merchants worried about who might report or manipulate prices. Farmers feared that taxes and bribes would consume their earnings before they could provide for their families. Local leaders were trapped between maintaining order and appeasing both the higher authorities and the powerful traders operating outside official channels. In such a climate, even ordinary interactions carried hidden calculations. Smiles could conceal resentment, and gestures of goodwill might mask ulterior motives. Education and moral guidance were not immune. Schools and community teachings once aimed at cultivating civic responsibility now struggled against pervasive cynicism. Children observed the contradictions in their elders' behavior, rules enforced for some, ignored for others. This fostered a sense of inequity that would echo through generations. Young people absorbed lessons about flexibility, negotiation, and survival over principles and justice. Norms shifted, and the long-term consequences of eroded ethics began taking root silently. Meanwhile, religious and cultural institutions, traditionally anchors of social cohesion, faced dilemmas of their own. Clerics and scholars recognized the moral decay but were limited in what they could do without drawing the ire of both authorities and powerful foreign interests. Some attempted to mediate, offering guidance and appealing to conscience, yet these efforts were often dismissed or manipulated. The community's moral compass wavered, caught between expectation and reality. Trade, though lucrative, became a vehicle for social tension. Opium, now embedded in daily life, created visible and invisible rifts. Families suffered from addiction-related hardships, and social services were ill-equipped to respond. Public health and safety deteriorated quietly, exacerbated by the informal networks and corrupt practices that had taken root. Even as some profited, the broader population felt the cumulative weight of disruption. At the same time, the international dimension heightened local anxieties. Foreign powers, observing the internal discord, pressed their advantages. The imbalance in economic and military influence allowed them to exploit weaknesses, further undermining local authority and feeding resentment among the population. This created a feedback loop. Internal corruption and social strain made resistance to external pressures more difficult, while foreign dominance deepened the sense of vulnerability and disempowerment. Amid this environment, certain individuals emerged as both symbols and agents of resistance. Officials, reformers, and activists risked personal safety to challenge the status quo, attempting to reclaim some measure of integrity. Their actions highlighted not only the systemic failures but also the possibility of change. Yet their efforts were met with mixed results. Resistance could inspire hope, but it also provoked backlash, demonstrating how deeply entrenched the challenges had become. Public perception, a vital currency in any society, began to shift dramatically. People's expectations of leadership and governance, once grounded in fairness and accountability, became tempered by pragmatism and fear. Stories of exploitation circulated widely, reinforcing cynicism and eroding loyalty to institutions. Individuals increasingly prioritized personal security and advantage over collective well-being. Social tension was also evident in the cultural sphere. Art, literature, and local storytelling reflected the growing disillusionment. Moral lessons became more cautionary, emphasizing survival in a corrupt and unpredictable world. Satire and allegory flourished as indirect ways to critique authority while avoiding direct reprisal. These creative expressions revealed the psychological and emotional undercurrents of a society under stress, offering insight into both the suffering and resilience of the people. Despite the chaos, there were glimmers of solidarity. Communities sometimes came together to support those most affected, whether victims of addiction, economic hardship, or institutional failure. Informal networks of assistance, based on kinship or neighborhood ties, provided limited relief. Yet these networks were fragile, constrained by the pervasive sense of mistrust and the omnipresent risk of exploitation. Ultimately, the social upheaval demonstrated how intertwined personal, communal, and institutional integrity had become. What began as economic and political conflict had evolved into a broader moral and social crisis. Survival was no longer solely a matter of resources. It depended on navigating a landscape riddled with ethical compromises, social suspicion, and shifting allegiances. The stage was set for decisive confrontation, where the consequences of prolonged social tension would become unavoidable. The fractures that had grown quietly over time were now visible, shaping choices and actions at every level. In this turbulent environment, the next steps taken by individuals, communities, and authorities would determine not just the outcome of trade disputes, but the broader trajectory of society itself. Social cohesion, trust, and stability once taken for granted had been compromised, revealing how deeply structural decay can penetrate the lives of ordinary people. The consequences of these tensions would echo far beyond the immediate conflict, influencing cultural, economic, and political dynamics for years to come. In this context, the challenges of governance, resistance, and reform were no longer abstract concepts. They were urgent, lived realities shaping the everyday existence of millions. The story of this period, therefore, is not just about conflict over goods or territory. It is a story about the erosion of trust, the fragility of social bonds, and the human capacity to adapt, endure, and occasionally resist in the face of overwhelming systemic pressure. It is a tale of how social tension can quietly transform the moral and ethical landscape of a society, leaving marks that linger long after the initial crisis has passed. Finally, as the story reached its culmination, the long-term consequences of the events became painfully clear. What had started as a seemingly straightforward series of economic and political challenges had evolved into a profound transformation of the social and cultural landscape. Entire communities were reshaped by the struggles they endured, and the echoes of these experiences continued to influence generations long after the immediate conflicts had faded. One of the most striking outcomes was the shift in leadership and authority. Those who had managed to navigate the turmoil successfully, whether through strategic alliances, pragmatic compromises, or sheer resilience, found themselves in positions of influence. In contrast, traditional structures that had once held unquestioned legitimacy were weakened. Local leaders, scholars, and officials who had resisted corruption or exploitation often faced marginalization, while opportunists and those willing to bend rules to suit foreign or commercial interests rose to prominence. This realignment of power created both opportunities and challenges. It allowed new ideas and approaches to emerge, yet it also entrenched patterns of inequality and exploitation. The cultural and moral consequences were equally profound. Values that had guided social interactions for generations, honesty, mutual trust, and communal responsibility, were recalibrated in light of lived experience. Adaptability, caution, and a certain pragmatic skepticism became dominant traits, shaping how people approached relationships, commerce, and civic life. The arts and literature of the period reflected these changes, often emphasizing survival, cleverness, and the tension between personal ambition and collective good. Storytelling, poetry, and theater became mediums through which people processed the turbulence, embedding lessons about resilience and the pitfalls of moral compromise. Education also transformed in response to the crisis. Learning institutions, previously focused on classical knowledge and ethical instruction, increasingly emphasized practical skills for navigating complex social and economic realities. Students were taught not only mathematics, literacy, and philosophy, but also negotiation, observation, and critical thinking aimed at discerning trustworthiness and opportunity. Knowledge was now inseparable from survival, and education became a tool to navigate uncertainty rather than solely a path toward moral or intellectual refinement. Public health and social welfare, once secondary concerns, also gained attention as a result of accumulated hardship. Communities recognized the importance of mutual support systems, disease prevention, and collective resilience, even if these efforts were often fragmented. Informal networks, familial ties, neighborhood coalitions, and religious institutions stepped in to fill gaps left by weakened governmental structures. These adaptations highlighted human ingenuity and solidarity, proving that even in the face of systemic failure, society could find ways to endure and preserve cohesion. Trade and economic structures, however, remained deeply affected. While some merchants and intermediaries thrived, the instability left lasting scars on local economies. Inequality grew more pronounced, and the population became adept at navigating both opportunity and risk. People learned to hedge against uncertainty, developing informal markets, reciprocal arrangements, and safety nets that often operated outside official channels. This economic agility was both a survival mechanism and a reflection of a society forced to reinvent its systems under pressure. International relations, too, were forever altered. The period of crisis revealed vulnerabilities that foreign powers could exploit, and lessons were learned about the importance of negotiation, diplomacy, and strategic foresight. Societies recognized that internal cohesion and ethical governance were crucial not only for domestic stability but also for defending against external pressures. The experience fostered a sense of cautious pragmatism in dealings with outsiders, reshaping the collective understanding of sovereignty and influence. Perhaps most importantly, the human spirit endured. Despite the moral compromises, social tension, and economic disruption, individuals and communities demonstrated remarkable resilience. Acts of kindness, courage, and solidarity persisted, often quietly and without recognition. These moments reminded everyone that even in periods of profound upheaval, human connection, empathy, and perseverance could survive, offering hope for renewal and reconstruction. In retrospect, the events serve as a powerful lesson about the interplay of power, morality, and society. Crises do not merely disrupt lives. They reshape values, institutions, and collective consciousness. What emerges is a society transformed not necessarily in ways fully predictable, but in ways that endure and influence generations. The story underscores the complexity of human response to challenge, illustrating how adversity can simultaneously reveal vulnerability and inspire extraordinary resilience. Looking forward, the legacy of this period became embedded in cultural memory, folklore, and historical reflection. Communities carried forward lessons about vigilance, integrity, and the delicate balance between individual ambition and collective responsibility. These experiences informed future governance, economic planning, and social norms, shaping a more cautious yet adaptable society. The narrative of struggle and adaptation became a touchstone, reminding subsequent generations of the costs of neglecting social cohesion and ethical governance. Ultimately, the story is about transformation of people, institutions, and societies under stress. It illustrates how crises can accelerate change, forcing re-evaluation of values, methods, and relationships. Yet it also emphasizes continuity. Even amid upheaval, human resilience, ingenuity, and solidarity persist, creating a foundation upon which recovery and growth can occur. The lessons learned resonate far beyond the immediate context, offering insight into the enduring dynamics of power, morality, and societal survival. In sum, the culmination of this period represents both an end and a beginning, the end of a phase marked by conflict, moral compromise, and social strain, and the beginning of a more aware, adaptive, and resilient society. The experiences etched into the collective consciousness serve as a lasting reminder of the human capacity to endure, to learn, and to forge forward even when faced with profound challenges. Through understanding this complex interplay of forces, we gain a richer appreciation for the fragility and strength inherent in any society navigating turbulent times. This completes the exploration of the final stage of the story, demonstrating how intertwined economic pressures, social tension, and moral choices converge to shape the trajectory of communities and individuals alike. The echoes of these events continue to inform our understanding of human resilience, adaptation, and the enduring pursuit of stability in a world defined by uncertainty. And so, as we reach the conclusion of this incredible journey through history, we can see how every challenge, every moral dilemma, and every small act of resilience played a part in shaping the society that emerged. The story teaches us about the delicate balance between power and ethics, survival and compassion, and how even in the most difficult times, human ingenuity and solidarity can endure. It reminds us that history is not just a series of events, but a tapestry of choices, consequences, and lessons that continue to echo into the present. Thank you all for joining me on this deep dive into a chapter of history that is both fascinating and thought-provoking. I hope this story has given you insight, inspiration, and a greater appreciation for the resilience of humanity. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and I will see you in the next video. Take care, everyone.